The world watched with astonishment as the General Assembly of the United Nations fell into a heavy silence. The atmosphere was tense, thick with expectation, when Captain Ibrahim Traoré, the young revolutionary leader of Burkina Faso, took to the podium. The cameras zoomed in, the translators prepared their microphones, and the delegates representing nations from every corner of the globe leaned forward to catch every word. For many, it was just another speech in the endless stream of debates and resolutions that define the UN. But for those who understood the shifting winds of global politics, it was far more than that. It was a moment of truth, a voice from Africa that dared to speak the words others feared, a final warning addressed directly to Benjamin Netanyahu and, by extension, to the powers that had dominated international affairs for decades. The weight of Traoré's words did not emerge in isolation. To grasp their magnitude, one must understand the context from which they arose. Burkina Faso is a landlocked country in West Africa, long marginalized by global systems, heavily exploited for its resources, and subjected to policies imposed by international financial institutions and foreign governments. For decades, its people endured poverty, instability, and neglect, while its gold, cotton, and land served the interests of outsiders. Then, in 2022, the rise of Captain Ibrahim Traoré marked a turning point. Young, unapologetic, and fiercely independent, he became a symbol of African resistance to neocolonialism. By 2025, his presence was no longer confined to local struggles. He had become a voice with continental and even global resonance. At the UN, the clash was not simply between Burkina Faso and Israel or between Traoré and Netanyahu. It was symbolic of a larger confrontation, the global South versus entrenched Western dominance, oppressed nations against elite control, sovereignty versus subjugation. When Traoré turned his attention toward Netanyahu, he was not merely speaking to the Israeli prime minister. He was addressing the entire system of global governance that had, in the eyes of many, failed to uphold justice and equality. His warning was framed as a message that transcended borders, a call to the conscience of humanity itself. The central issue that drove Traoré's final warning was the escalating conflict in the Middle East, particularly Israel's actions in Gaza and the broader Palestinian territories. For years, debates at the UN had followed a predictable script: condemnations, counter-condemnations, vetoes, and resolutions that rarely altered realities on the ground. What made Traoré's intervention different was not only his blunt language, but also the moral authority he carried as a leader who himself had resisted domination. He saw the struggle of the Palestinians not as an isolated regional conflict, but as a mirror of the African experience of colonization, occupation, and resistance. In his words, Gaza was not just Gaza. It was Ouagadougou under French control. It was the Congo under Belgium. It was South Africa under apartheid. By linking these histories, he placed Netanyahu's government within the same framework as the colonial powers of old, a comparison that struck deeply at the legitimacy of Israel's policies. But Traoré went beyond historical parallels. His warning carried geopolitical weight. He pointed out that the world was shifting toward multipolarity, that the days when a few powers could dictate outcomes unilaterally were drawing to a close. The rise of Africa, the consolidation of alliances across Asia, the growing independence of Latin America, and the assertiveness of nations like China and Russia were changing the equation. For Israel to continue its course, he argued, was not only morally bankrupt but strategically unsustainable. Traoré's words were clear: the world will not stand by forever. The oppressed are learning to resist together, and when that tide rises, no veto, no military arsenal, and no propaganda machine will be able to contain it. The silence that followed was not merely a pause. It was the collective recognition that something unusual had occurred. Rarely does a leader from one of the poorest nations in the world seize the global stage so effectively that even the most powerful are compelled to listen. Netanyahu's delegation remained stone-faced, but the discomfort was visible. Other Western delegations shifted uneasily. Meanwhile, representatives from Africa, Latin America, and parts of Asia nodded in quiet agreement. They had heard in Traoré's voice the echo of their own frustrations. His final warning was not a threat of war, but a warning of consequences. He spoke of the moral isolation that Israel risked if it continued down the path of perpetual aggression. He warned of the economic repercussions as boycotts and divestment campaigns gained traction across the global south. He highlighted the political consequences, where nations once silenced by dependency were now emboldened by unity, ready to challenge the old order. And he underlined the cultural consequences, that the narrative of Israel as a victim state was unraveling, replaced by an image of oppressor, an image that no amount of public relations could easily erase. What made this moment even more powerful was the authenticity with which Traoré spoke. He was not a leader reading carefully crafted lines from speechwriters. He was a man whose own life had been shaped by the struggle against oppression. His rise had not been through privilege or dynastic succession, but through courage, conviction, and the will of his people. That authenticity resonated. It reminded the world that leadership is not measured by the size of one's economy or the power of one's military, but by the truth one dares to speak in the face of injustice. For Netanyahu, the warning was deeply personal. His political career has been built on a platform of strength, resistance to outside pressure, and defiance of critics. Yet, in the chamber of the UN, he was confronted not by another great power, but by the voice of an African captain representing a small, struggling country. The contrast was stark, and it carried a message that power is not always about weapons or wealth. It is also about moral authority, and in that moment, Netanyahu faced a deficit he could not ignore. The broader implications of Traoré's speech are profound. It marked a shift in the role of African leaders on the global stage. For too long, Africa had been treated as an object of international politics, a continent to be managed, pitted, or exploited. With Traoré's warning, Africa was no longer a passive participant. It was a continent that could issue challenges, set terms, and demand respect. This was not merely about Israel and Palestine. It was about Africa asserting its place as a moral and political actor in shaping global narratives. Critics, of course, dismissed Traoré's words as grandstanding. They argued that Burkina Faso has neither the power nor the influence to change realities in the Middle East. But such criticisms miss the point. The significance of Traoré's speech lies not in immediate outcomes, but in its symbolic power. Every great shift in history begins with voices that are initially dismissed as irrelevant. The anti-apartheid struggle was once marginalized. The calls for decolonization were once ridiculed. Yet in time, they reshaped the world. Traoré's warning may well be remembered as one of those catalytic moments when the global conscience was jolted by the unexpected. The reaction across the world was telling. Social media exploded with clips of his speech. In Africa, he was celebrated as a hero for daring to say what others would not. In Latin America, commentators drew parallels with their own resistance to U.S. hegemony. In Asia, analysts pointed out that Traoré's words aligned with a broader trend of rejecting Western double standards. Even in Europe and North America, where mainstream media downplayed the event, alternative outlets highlighted the courage and clarity of his message. The symbolism of a final warning also resonated. Traoré did not present endless demands or vague proposals. He spoke as though the time for persuasion had passed, as though history itself was delivering its judgment. That sense of urgency is what gave his words their edge. They were not just observations. They were a call to action, a reminder that neutrality in the face of injustice is complicity, and that the world cannot afford to stand idle any longer. In the days and weeks that followed, debates intensified. Was Traoré right to frame Netanyahu's policies as colonial oppression? Was it appropriate for a leader of Burkina Faso to intervene so forcefully in Middle Eastern affairs? These questions revealed the discomfort of those who had long controlled the narrative. For ordinary people, however, the answer was clear. In Traoré's words, they found truth unfiltered by diplomacy, a a truth that resonated because it spoke to universal principles of justice and freedom. Ultimately, the episode is not just about what was said, but about what it represents. It is a sign that the monopoly of power over global discourse is cracking. It shows that voices from unexpected places can challenge even the most established leaders. It demonstrates that the demand for justice is not confined to one region, but is a global aspiration. And it affirms that the future of international politics will be shaped not only by military and economic might, but also by the courage to confront uncomfortable truths. Traoré's final warning to Netanyahu may not alter policies overnight. It may not bring an immediate end to the conflict in Gaza or dismantle decades of entrenched systems. But history often moves not in sudden leaps, but in cumulative steps. One speech becomes a spark, inspiring others to speak, to act, to resist. That is how change gathers momentum, and that is the legacy of Traoré's words at the United Nations. As the session adjourned and delegates filed out, the cameras lingered on Traoré. He did not look triumphant, nor did he seek applause. He looked resolute, as though he understood the gravity of what had just occurred. For him, it was not about personal glory, but about carrying the voice of the oppressed, about reminding the world that Africa has something to say and that it will no longer be silenced. In that quiet resolve, one could sense the beginning of something larger than any single leader, larger than any single nation, a movement of humanity insisting that justice, dignity, and sovereignty must prevail. And so the story will be told that in 2025, at the United Nations, a young captain from a small African country stood before the world and issued a warning to one of the most entrenched powers of the modern era, that he dared to speak truth to authority when others remained silent, that he transformed the chamber from a theater of diplomacy into a tribunal of conscience, and that his voice, carrying the weight of history, echoed far beyond those walls, into the hearts and minds of people everywhere who still believe that justice is worth fighting for.